Beautiful. Thank you, Jean. So this is the August 3rd, 2022 meeting of the Missisquoi Basin Water Quality Council held on Zoom. It's also our annual meeting. I see in the agenda. Thank you, Dean. So welcome everyone. I know there's a couple additional faces today. So let's do a quick introduction of everyone. Actually, let's review the Zoom protocol and then let's do the introduction. So people can be updating their Zoom names as we're here. And so thank you, Jean. Oh, maybe, there we go. Oh. So if you are able to, please change the name of your Zoom name to your full name, the organization that you work for or represent, if you are voting or alternate or public, I guess, and pronouns if you would like. So once again, we expect you to have your cameras turned on if possible. We hope that you'll be engaged with the meeting. Please use the raise hand function on Zoom when you request, if you are requesting to speak, or you can physically raise your hand and I'll try to keep an eye on that. Please stay muted until you're called upon, and any comments made in the chat will be read aloud. Just a reminder of that. With that, we can start some introductions. So I will go first. I'm Lauren Weston with the Franklin County Natural Resources Conservation District. I am a voting member and I'm also the chair of this WIC, and my pronouns are she, her, and I will just call on people. So on my screen, Kent, would you like to go next?
Okay, thank you. Kent Henderson with the Friends of Northern Lake Champlain, and I occupy a seat on the council.
Pete, would you like to go next? Ooh, Pete, you're on mute.
No, okay, there we go. I'm Pete Benevento from the Franklin Watershed Committee, also the Lake Carmi Campus Association. I was invited as a guest, and thank you for the invitation.
Thanks, Pete. Dan.
I'm Dan. I'm representing Richford.
Thanks, Dan. Lindsay.
Hi, I'm Lindsay White with the Missisquoi River Basin Association. I'm your vice chair, voting member, and my pronouns are she, her.
Tom.
I'm Rizzleton, Friends of Northern Lake Champlain alternate.
Abe.
Hello, I'm Abraham Ames. I work for the Orleans County Conservation District. I'm a voting member as far as I know, at least. Okay, good confirmation. Thank you. And my pronouns are he, him. Thank you.
Barry.
Barry Lamke with Northwest Regional Planning Commission, voting member, he, him.
Beth.
Hi, I'm Beth Torpy with NVDA. I'm a voting member. I'm she, her, and pardon any dogs in the background when I'm speaking.
We would love to hear them. Sarah.
Sarah Downs. I'm a voting member, and I'm from Enosburg and the municipal representative.
Karen.
Karen Bates, tactical basin planner for the Missisquoi Bay for DEC, so technical assistance provider.
Jim.
Jim Pease, I'm a retired DEC employee, so I'm working as a volunteer, I guess, and a he, him.
Vicky.
Hi, Lauren. Vicky Drew, on the board for both the Franklin County Natural Resource Conservation District, and today invited to serve as a member of the public through the Friends of Northern Lake Champlain, which I'm also on the board for. Thank you.
And Ellen.
I'm Ellen Fox. I work with the Missisquoi River Basin Association, and I am an alternate.
Excellent. Dean, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, good morning, everybody. Dean Pierce on the staff at the NRPC, which is the clean water service provider for the Missisquoi Basin. Welcome, everybody.
Wonderful. Yeah, thanks everybody for being here. Move on to reviewing and then adjusting and approving the agenda, an annual meeting acknowledgement. Does anyone have any changes to make to the agenda? Seeing none, we will approve the agenda and continue onwards. Jean, would you like to acknowledge that this is the annual meeting?
I think you have, but I will just go further and say for the record, the first meeting after the start of the fiscal year under the bylaws is the annual meeting. In future years, it will be a meeting at which elections take place, but since the organization is so new, the elections were held back in April, and we're not going to rerun the elections just after 3 months. But in future years, there will be those types of activities to take care of, and possibly others, since it will be the beginning of a new fiscal year. But I think that's all that would be required at this point.
Wonderful. Happy annual meeting, everyone. And we can review the minutes from our last meeting. Dean, I don't know if you can, yep. And then make maybe view as full page.
Is it appearing small?
Yes.
Is it better now?
No, that made it worse.
So strange. Hold on.
You might have to go into view.
I just have it as a PDF file, so hold on.
It is in your packets too, everyone, but I know some folks maybe didn't get the packets because they're members of the public, so we will make this work. Ooh, that just made it. I guess if you just want to scroll through, Dean, that works fine. I will note that since the last meeting where we did talk about the switch for the Orleans district of Abraham Ames becoming the WIC member and Sarah Damsel becoming the alternate, there was a formal documented change of that. So Abraham Ames is the voting member and Sarah Damsel is the alternate. Yes, Kent.
While you're on that topic of alternate changes, Vicky Drew is a former state conservationist and a new member of the Friends of Northern Lake Champlain. We're very excited about adding her to our board. And it has been suggested that Tom Brizendale is willing to step down as an alternate. and to be replaced by Vicky on the council. So we invited her to observe today. I did send a written notice of this to Dean, but not to the entire council. And I looked at the bylaws again and see that I need to inform the entire council of that intention. So I can't bring it to action today, but that's something that we'd like to consider.
I will mention that we should probably have a conversation because she's also on my board too. And so that might cause some layers of conflict of interest when it comes to voting. But I think that can be something that we explore offline in terms of how that might work as well. Dean, I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, I do think that we can just do a little bit of legwork between now and the next meeting. It isn't on the agenda for today, so it wouldn't be acted upon. And it is going to complicate things, I think, if one of the aims with alternates is that they're there to be able to vote in a case where an organization has a conflict. An alternate with 2 affiliations, it just may be more problematic. Having no connection at all to the person's qualifications, it's just that we have to contend with the language in the rule that says when the sponsoring organization has a project that's subject to a vote, then they can't vote, although they can comment on the project. In cases where we have enough people in attendance, motions will still be able to pass, but we should just have a little bit more discussion to try to figure out the best way forward.
Sounds great. And yes, we'll be sure to add this to the agenda for our next meeting, Kent, as well, to formalize or state one way or the other how this is going to work. So that will be great. Any other comments on the meeting minutes from last meeting? All right. Seeing none. Would anyone like to make a motion to approve the minutes? If you do, you can come off mute. Kent, go ahead.
We approve the minutes.
All right, so Dan Sealy makes a motion.
This is Kent, I second.
All right. Any abstentions if you were not at the meeting? Seeing none. All in favor, say aye, or actually don't say aye. Raise your hand, give me a thumbs up, or do the Zoom thumbs up if you are a voting member. So I see Kent, Dan, Abe, Beth, Sarah, Lindsay, Barry are all in favor. Any nays? All right, motion passes. And we can move right along. This is the time for public comment not related to items on the agenda. So if anyone would like to make a comment, now would be the time. All right, seeing none, we will continue onward. All right, so Dean, I think what you need to do is hover lower again on the PDF and set it to the third icon from the right. Yeah.
You said hover lower. I wasn't sure what you meant, but it is, if it looks better now, that's great. And if it needs to be changed, let me know.
Okay, looks good to me. And I'll let you take it away from here.
My apologies there. Is it still okay? Okay.
Yes, it is.
Okay. So there was material in the meeting packet concerning this issue, which is where we're basically just making sure everybody has in their possession a copy of the approved bylaws, but then just revisit some of the discussion related to the bylaws and the public participation policy. In brief, the bylaws authorize the use of committees to do certain portions of the council's work. That's point number one. Point number two is that the interim public participation policy that the group adopted calls for the creation of a working group to create a permanent policy, or to recommend, to develop a permanent policy, recommend it to the council for adoption. It's section 503 of the bylaw says the council may by majority vote establish committees to advance its work. Section 801 in part says that work of the council and I believe by extension committees would have to happen in accordance with the open meeting law. The relevant section of the public participation policy says that it will be amended as appropriate, and that a working group of the council will be created to focus on this task. So in terms of what the council can do today, it could adopt a motion that would authorize the creation of a committee, the purpose of which is to propose a revised public participation policy. I have gone on as far as to identify 3 people who I believe had said were interested in serving in that committee. And I've also just got for the commission or the council's consideration the possibility that the maker of a motion might want to say also that the chair can add people, but that would be up to the maker of the motion. I just thought it would be simpler to give that authority to the chair, or maybe the chair and the vice chair, so that we don't have to come back to the council for something as maybe as limited in scope as adding additional people to the committee, but that would be up to the group. So that's where we are with that, and be happy to answer any questions.
Dean, I'll add that Kent and Tom were also interested in being on that committee. And I had voluntold Lindsay too, but Lindsay, you don't need to do it. We do seem to have a number of folks interested. Any questions for Dean? Or anyone want to take their name off or put their name on that list? All right. Would someone like to make a motion building off of Dean's motion on the screen?
A motion to accept this as written with the addition of Tom and Kent and myself if I'm still voluntold or needed. This is Lindsay, for the record.
Do I hear a second?
I'll second it.
All right, that was Dan. Beautiful. All right. Just to clarify, Lindsay, did your motion include that additional members may be appointed by the chair?
Yes.
Thank you. Would anyone like to abstain from this vote? Seeing none, please raise your hand or give me a thumbs up if you would like to vote in favor of this motion. All right, I see Kent, Dan, Lindsay, Abe, Barry, Beth, Sarah. Excellent. Would anyone against this motion? Please raise your hand. Seeing none, motion passes. In terms of next steps, I do have some resources that Dean shared with me, as well as some other ones that I've looked into, and so we'll share those out in the follow-up email from this. If folks on the committee could give a review of those before our next September meeting, that would be appreciated. Additionally, Dean and I were trying to figure out following open meeting law, trying to get a regularly scheduled meeting of that subgroup. I think that would be a useful thing. I guess from the doodle poll initially, the next most participatory option was immediately after this meeting on the first Wednesday of the month from 1 to 3. And so maybe Dean, if we can, in the follow-up email, just confirm with the folks on the committee that that time does indeed work to just make these quick meetings perhaps an hour longer for the folks on that subcommittee. So it would be from 11 to 2 for folks on the subcommittee. And if there's ever a week or ever a month we don't need to meet or something like that, we can, cut it short as needed. How does that sound? I see one thumbs up. Excellent. All right. So you'll get some documents from me or from me through Dean, and they include the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission's public participation policy. It's very comprehensive. There's also some things from the Vermont League of Cities and Towns that I thought were useful about social media and timely tips for community engagement. I'll also include the law as enacted for the environmental justice bill that just passed the Vermont legislature earlier this spring, as well as the Rejoice Collective, which is an environmental justice organization in Vermont that did table talks around Vermont during COVID. Yes, Barry.
Has there been any thought about holding in-person meetings?
No.
Okay.
But there probably should be.
I know there's a balance in terms of convenience and access for the public for both options. So just want to put it out there.
Definitely. I do believe in law through at least the end of this year, only online open meetings are still allowed. But we can confirm that, and obviously in-person meetings do increase access, having a place for someone to show up. So maybe Dean and I can chat through that as well about at least having it somewhere. Okay, so Dean, you and I can chat. Yes, Barry.
We may want to have one out of X number of meetings be public, X number of times a year, something like that. I'm sorry, in person, that's what I mean.
Certainly. We will look into that. Dean, I don't know if your offices are open again to the public or not. They are, okay.
Yes, our offices are open, although we ask for appointments because we're not there all the time. But yes, the offices are open. So they could be the location.
Excellent. Much easier than trying to coordinate room rentals, as I'm learning repeatedly every time I have to coordinate a room rental. Yeah, so we can chat about that for sure. Not for a vote, but will people maybe in the chat or something post how regularly they would consider meeting in person? Quarterly, every month, twice a year. That would be helpful just for planning purposes moving forward. Yes, Barry.
Just the other thing, as somebody who's also looking at scheduling meetings, outside is a great option, though the season grows short.
Indeed it does. I don't know, Lindsay's got a pretty great tent. It's enormous and it's very useful, and we got to use it the other day. That's why I'm making this joke. Sorry, I realize most of you don't know that. All right.
I'm just gonna call attention to the chat. Abe said he would want to do more than quarterly, which is, yeah, we're a big geographic space.
We are. And we could certainly, you know, in theory, rotate locations or something like that, or make sure we're smack dab in the middle of everyone's route.
And what about a hybrid? Having a hybrid option for the people who won't be able to make it. I'm almost 2.5 hours from St. Albans. So, and in the wintertime, that can be a really hairy drive over Jay Peak and through Montgomery and everything. So a hybrid
Definitely.
option would be very awesome.
Noted. And yes, I hate driving in the winter as well. So we'll respect that. Yeah, I think Dean and I can find a spot that will work for our collective needs, certainly. Please do keep posting in the chat, and maybe later on we can report back out what is posted in the chat once everybody's responded. Dean, I believe we can move on to, oh, actually, no. There'd been comment following the last meeting about the term in the, I think, public participation policy about the term marginalized, I think, or minority groups. Dean, do you have the public participation policy open? You are muted as well.
In just a moment, yes.
Wonderful. I'm realizing that it might actually have been in the bylaws when we were describing not using consensus-based voting. That might actually be where it is. I apologize. I think it was minority too, not marginalized. That's my bad. Minority, not majority.
The minority is not
there. It's in the Roberts, where we describe using Robert's rules. If that's, I think that's section. I apologize about this, folks. Dean, can you scroll up again? Just to the bottom of that page, I think.
Lauren,
I will.
I think.
Thank you.
Can yeah, I think that it was in the section on consensus in the bylaw. So you were right that it was about the decision-making piece.
So, but this is not the final language we decided on, I don't think.
Right. There was yeah, there was a different section than that.
Yeah, we definitely rephrased that during the last meeting. So maybe we'll track this down on the back end and bring it to the next meeting. Apologies, everyone, about this. Sorry for not catching that sooner. I I caught the Lamoille issue, but then didn't recatch the updated Missisquoi. So apologies once again. Moving on in the agenda. Dean, I have recap, discussion, and approval of bylaws and future topics. I'm wondering if there's a discussion about future topics that we need to have.
It would really be only if there were other things about the bylaws that people felt deserved some attention. And my apologies more than anybody's if there was the wrong copy. Well, firstly, for sending the Lamoille bylaws, but I was pretty sure that the version that I sent you was the adopted version. But anyway, we will straighten that out. But there was nothing specific. It was really just, we're talking about making changes or updating, doing additional work on the public participation policy. I think of bylaws as living documents, not something that you change every day, but if there were parts of the bylaws that people felt were, okay, it's a good start, but we want to continue to develop them. I know that there was some consideration to revisiting conflict of interest when the DEC has issued its guidance document. That's maybe the most specific thing. That document, that chapter still hasn't been released, but maybe it's just enough for everybody to hear that today and know that when the guidance document comes out and is finalized, it may be something that leads to some changes to that section of the council's bylaws.
Excellent. So then moving on in the agenda, the results of the survey on inclusion.
This is something of just a recheck or a check in. In the packets was some material that showed what the responses, the written responses to the online survey regarding inclusion were. Those responses haven't changed. I just wanted to provide the group with the opportunity to discuss those if it would like. I was also going to share the regional plan update schedule, at least the current version, because this information that the councils are providing and other committees that the Regional Planning Commission works with are providing is going to help shape the regional plan. So I just thought people might be interested in seeing what that plan update schedule is, just very, very briefly. I guess I wouldn't say much more about the responses unless there were questions about them, because again, they were in the meeting packets and it's in a slightly different format today. The regional plan schedule, just for people's information, has work on 3 sections taking place in the first month, that is this month, August, with a meeting of the regional plan committee held in the middle of September on the 12th. So but I believe, and Barry can help me out with this because I was away last week, I believe that there was a presentation at the Regional Planning Commission meeting last Wednesday where the results of the survey overall were shared with the commissioners. And again, my understanding is that it's going to be information that's used to help shape the guiding principles for the update of the plan. This is really an opportunity for the council to, I guess, reiterate any points that were made. It could just leave things as they are, or if there was something that people felt as a group needed to be clarified, you could do so, but there's no action required.
Gary, go ahead.
I can just share. So the Dean is correct. We did present this to the commissioners and a number of subcommittees, committees of the board and groups that the Planning Commission works with. And one of the themes that did come up was the addition of income as a factor here. So I want to just put that out there.
An addition of income for, like, as a category in the plan? Okay.
Yeah. Well, not in the plan, but as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, that in our statement, in NRPC statement, income was not listed as an element, and a number of people have called that out as something that we need to pay attention to.
Gotcha.
And potentially revise the statement and incorporate into our work going forward.
Thanks, Barry. And Dean, I'll just mention, if the folks at NRPC are going through a natural and cultural resources review, would love to chat, if that would be helpful.
And as the person that got assigned that section, I would love to chat as well. So we should make our agenda a little bit longer. And just to help people understand Barry's point a little bit more, I'm hoping that you can see the actual statement, and what I believe Barry's referring to is that people felt that someone's income status would also be celebrated, recognized, and so on. So it would be added to this list. Is that right, Barry? It would be added to the list since it's not included at present.
Barry gave you a thumbs up, Dean.
Okay.
And I'll just say, I do think, how this all fits into our work will most likely become clear during the public participation working group meetings that will bring results back to this full BWIC. Thanks everybody for taking that survey. And is the survey still up, Dean, if folks haven't filled it out yet?
I don't know the answer to that question. So I'm not sure. I didn't create it, so I wouldn't have taken it down, but I'm not certain.
Okay. We will follow up on that if you still want the opportunity to, or if you just have comments that you'd like to submit, please also just at any point in time, submit them to myself or Dean or both of us and Lindsay. CC her on that email too. Wonderful. Moving on to the prioritization framework. Dean, you're on mute again.
Thank you. This is a topic that, like the last one, is I think, given how slowly things are unwinding with the formula fund contracts, so-called, that it's information that you've heard before. I'm not trying to beat a dead horse with it, but I just want people to be aware of these basic requirements that are established in rule, and convey that we're going to work within that framework. We are, as a QUISP, still waiting for the DEC guidance materials, but I see this as an opportunity for people to become familiar with these basic elements of the system that we are in. And so I've referred to the prioritization framework before. I just want people to understand it. And I will also say, and we've had some encouragement as part of the discussions with the Lamoille Council, that at the next meeting, or if not at the next meeting, the one after, we would be illustrating this framework with some project data. I am still wrestling with which projects we would plug in, because I don't want to bias either for or against any project. So I may end up choosing some projects that are real world projects, but say they may be in Basin 5, so the Champlain Basin, rather than the Missisquoi Basin, so that there's no complication. Or I may also just use as examples projects that have been completed. But the framework is that there are 6 categories that would be used to create an initial score and come up with an initial ranking of candidate projects. And first I should say that there'll basically be 2 pools of projects. There'll be design and implementation projects, and there'll be the very early stage projects. The ranking of the design and implementation projects will use all 6 categories. Those categories are spelled out in rule. We are assuming that the criteria will have rate, and that the overall score that a project gets will be a function of multiplying an individual score with a weight. It's kind of like if you're in school and you're in a class and you have a certain number of tests that make up your final score, the final exam may be more heavily weighted, and so on. That'll give us an initial ranking of projects, and that project priority, basically the class ranking list, will be brought to the council for the council's action. One place that the council will probably have a fair amount of discussion is in connection with co-benefits. There will be co-benefit information provided as part of an application, but it would be I'll say relatively high level at the first stage, and then it would be more in more detail when it reaches the council. That's the overall framework. I don't need to dwell on this too much, but pollution reduction is one of those main, I call them pillars, and that could be thought of as in terms of the kilograms or pounds of phosphorus a project will remove. Cost effectiveness and how much it costs per kilogram removed. The lifespan of the project is one of those pillars spelled out. The operation and maintenance performance of a project is one of those things. Conformance with the tactical basin plan implementation table is one of those. And then I've mentioned co-benefits. I am touching on a topic that came up before, and that is these criteria are somewhat interrelated. Pollution, cost effectiveness and pollution reduction are interrelated. So if you're kind of a purist in terms of these kinds of things and looking for wholly independent variables, that's not how this system is going to operate. And similarly with operation and maintenance, it is related to durability and cost effectiveness. So those are clusters, essentially. Things that might be missing that have come up in discussions before are some criteria having to do with project viability. Another area would be impact on cultural or socioeconomic populations. And as I have said before, my view is for now, and I'm interested in feedback, is that project viability is going to be addressed to a considerable degree as part of the screening process that takes place. It's also my view that the impact on cultural groups or socioeconomic groups that will be included as part of the co-benefits discussion. But that doesn't mean that one of those things couldn't be pulled out and made its own. It just makes it more challenging because if you do it for one, you may want to do it for several, and that ends up reducing the impact. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because I don't think it needs to be dwelled upon too much, but there is an established process for evaluating projects and screening them, determining their basic eligibility for the types of funding that we're talking about. There is a step of historically, there's been a step of making sure a project is in the database. The projects moving forward will need to be in the database. The details of that may evolve a little bit. But then there's a step for reviewing projects by program. So DEC staff will be consulted in the development of projects. So that's gonna be an opportunity for the viability of the project to be ascertained by someone who's independent. And then there's also permit screening, and whether or not a project will be eligible for permits is going to have a significant impact on its viability. So the point I'm just trying to make is that I would be interested in hearing about other aspects of project viability that the council might see as being worked into the prioritization process in some way. But I do think that if nothing were done, then a big part of that issue would be addressed through that screening process. I'm gonna stop at this point and maybe just answer any questions that people have.
Dean, there was a comment in the chat from Beth about getting a copy of the project eligibility process, perhaps with the post-meeting information. And then I also just was thinking through how those scores will be calculated for anything but an implementation project, because you don't really have any of those numbers or designs or volumes until you're done with your 100% design. And I guess I'm curious if this process in effect makes it impossible for someone to go in the same, for someone to do a final design and implementation project combined as one step following a 30% design. If you have a good cost estimate, I guess I'm just curious if you do indeed now need to do a project development application, a 30% design, a final design, and then a implementation as 4 different applications. And you're muted.
Yeah, so I think as the QUISP, we're going to be looking to minimize the steps as much as possible. I didn't clarify enough, I guess. The use of the criteria that I described is really going to be it's a better description of prioritization for the projects whose viability has already been determined. So if you're asking, will a simpler process be used for projects that are in an investigation phase, then yes, because the point of that investigation phase is to determine its viability. So yes, if someone was saying, we want to use viability as a criterion for evaluating requests for funds to do project identification, my reaction would be, we can't know that, because that's what the whole point of the identification and development is to determine those things that will let us know if it's viable. So is this answer helping?
So I guess my concern is that in the past, there are several steps before you get to implementation. And it seems to me like that criteria really only applies at that implementation application. And I guess I'm just thinking, wouldn't it be unfortunate if we funded project development, 30% design, 100% design, and then got to a point where it was now being like viewed through a different lens than just viability, and it got dropped down at the implementation phase, I guess is a thought, and just thinking about like that calculator can really only work at the implementation phase.
Yeah, so yeah, there's I guess if you're highlighting the danger of projects that have been funded being somehow penalized by a finding that they're not viable, we want to avoid that. There's an image that I had shared for, well, I had planned to share it in a minute, and maybe I'll show it now. So I'm hoping people can see this. So here's the council at the top. The QUISP and its partners are in this middle lane, and DEC is in this bottom lane. And as I'm understanding things, a request by a partner for an identification or development project is going to go through some process where it's prioritized by the QUISP and given to the council for prioritization. And it's not going to go through an intensive screening process. It's not going to be evaluated in terms of its viability, because the purpose of the work is to help determine its viability. Okay. If something is being proposed for design and implementation, and it's really, we're going to be throwing significant amounts of money. We want to know that it's viable before we do that. So the QUISP and the partners preparing this are going to want to establish its viability by going through a screening process. And if it survives that screening process, then it will be prioritized and given to the council for the final ranking. So I think what I heard you saying, or if we can work within that, maybe you can pose your question, Lauren. Is it you would rather it only be implementation projects, so that design projects up to what percentage would be along with ID and development without going through screening in order to be ranked?
I guess I would actually say I think the screening's fine. I think it's the prioritization by the WIC/QUISP that can't, like those 6 metrics you won't have until you have 100% design already.
Okay, so now I'm understanding. We're gonna have to use the best surrogates for those things that we can. So DEC has said, here are our tools for estimating phosphorus reduction. Use them consistently in order to estimate phosphorus reduction. So that'll be how we do it. We'll do it as best we can using those tools. And I'll just say it quickly as an aside, there is an interim spreadsheet that was released just before I left on vacation. And so if you haven't seen that, I'll make sure you get a copy of it. But that's going to be the tool for calculating the phosphorus reduction. The issue of cost, well, costs change all the time, but we're going to need some estimate of cost for a prioritization to take place. Now, maybe it gets minimized, but in order to know cost effectiveness, we have to know some measure of cost. So we will have to do the best we can to come up, and the partners that are applying for a project will have to provide a number for a project as best they can so that we can know cost effectiveness. I guess I'm not sure if what is being suggested is that we would only use those 6, or we would only use the full range of projects, or we would only use the full range of criteria when it's an implementation project. I hadn't thought about that before. I'm gonna just say I hadn't thought of it that way, but I can think about it that way. And if the council feels that's how it should be done, then yeah, the QUISP will be thinking about it. It's just not something that I had. It's not something I had thought of would be the case, because my understanding had been we used the criteria and we used the best available information that we can with the criteria at whatever stage the project is seeking funding for. Long-winded answer. Sorry about that.
Right, I guess, yeah, that would be my comment and suggestion as someone who has seen plenty of 100% designs that look very different from a 30% design in terms of where the work is happening, like how long is the stream restoration project and all of those types of things. It would be I would like to at least have a further discussion at some point about when we use the calculator on what types of applications. And I guess my next question would be, in this process, do we know if all 4 steps in theory, or at least all 3 steps, are required for a project? By that, I mean, does every project require step 1's a 30% design, step 2 is 100% design, step 3 is a implementation? And so it's 3 different requests for funding from the WIC for the same project, in theory, over 3 years as funding rounds become open.
My understanding is that not all projects go through all of those steps. The CWIP funding policy has some project types that don't require all of those steps. So I think as long as the request is consistent with that policy, those are the steps that it goes through.
Okay.
And the QUISP will not, I can't imagine why the QUISP would want to increase the number of steps. There's no reason. There's no reason for that.
Okay. And then just wondering about, let's say we got our 100% design funded by the Lake Champlain Basin program. Is there any issue with then bringing that project to implementation by the QUISP, or vice versa? Does the project have to go fully funded through the QUISP or not?
I don't believe it needs to go through, and this is something there's a very current discussion having to do with the so-called enhancement funds and which projects go which route. And I know that that's very much under discussion right now. And what role would the QUISPs or the BWICs play in directing projects to various funding sources? I don't think any of it is settled, but I had never heard anything that suggested that the only projects that the council would be prioritizing are those that have all started with the council funding. I don't think there would be anything that would stop someone with a project that was designed using Basin Program funds from coming to the council and seeking the funds to do the implementation.
Okay. And one more question, and then I'll be quiet. That's a lie, probably. Just thinking about the gut check from DEC and the different people who have to review a project. Do they know that they're going to have to be reviewing all of these projects in a timely manner? Do they have a requirement to respond to us in a timely fashion when we submit an application to them? Because that has been a bottleneck in the past for funding.
Yeah, as someone who's waiting for that kind of feedback on something himself, I know it is. I hope that this is clarified in chapter 6 of the guidance. And if it's not, then I think it would be one of the things we would comment on. But I don't have any specific information about whether or not there will be deadlines placed on DEC staff for review. I put a question mark in that graphic because this is a little speculative. There's nothing I've heard that suggests that there won't be screening in the future, but will the system of screening need to change in the QUISP-BWIC era? I think it will, but we haven't seen how it's going to change, and we haven't seen whether or not there will be any kind of deadlines placed.
Okay. And then I'm just going to say similar comments what I said in the Loyal meeting. It still is a little unclear what the role of the BWIC is now that DEC has so many oversight and screening steps. It does still feel a little confusing to me, which I know I shouldn't say as the chair, but I hope to keep clarifying our specific influence and role as a group. Yes, Kent.
Thank you. And I'm not sure if this relates or if this is the right time to bring it up, but with the volatility of prices and inflation, it's been I've come to believe that DEC is overwhelmed with amended contracts at this time on projects that were set up and ready to go and had adequate funding, and now with increased costs have had to go back and amend contracts. Will amendments like that, will that only be the responsibility of the QUISP, or will those amended contracts, will they come back before the councils?
I think it's going to I think it's going to depend, but it won't be DEC. I guess what I'm saying would depend is whether or not something could be handled by the QUISP and the party that's doing the project that got the project prioritized, because you know, we may need to come up with some kind of language that is part of whatever approval motion that the WIC makes, the council makes, so that we don't handcuff ourselves, you know, so that there would be the flexibility so that when the council prioritizes a project, a list, and approves it, that there's some tolerance for changes like that that won't make a project stop and then have to come back to the council for some kind of reevaluation. That would make sense to me. Not that we want to, you know, create an opportunity for a project to, you know, have scope creep, but there won't be a DEC role as far as I know. And I think that when we have the approval of the priority list, it's going to depend on how the motion reads. If the motion accounts for the possibility of some changes in cost, which would affect the cost effectiveness, yada, 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 I would certainly not want to have to bring everything back to the council. I would like for there to be some kind of flexibility or tolerance for that, where it can just be an amendment within some parameter that the QUISP handles with the party. That would be my desire.
Okay, well, that'll be an interesting situation as we go forward, because you know, sometimes these amendments or these projects, the whole scope of the project has to change, has to be reduced, which also reduces the amount of phosphorus and sediment that you're keeping out. And it really kind of changes the basis of the project. So, but that's good to hear, is that it wouldn't have to go all the way back through the whole approval process again. Is what you're saying.
Yeah, and if I can just continue to hold the floor for just a second more, you know, these are questions that have to do with how many applications are seeking funding in a given year, and if we know how much money is available in a given year and we are under budget, then we have some room. We are not constrained. So the situation that you just described, where you're going to have to cut the scope, well, that might not exist in the Missisquoi, because we have relatively large amounts of funding. And so I'm foreseeing the possibility of, due to material costs or what have you, a project's cost could go up by some amount, and it isn't going to require us to say to the party, oh, sorry, you got to reduce your scope. I mean, and maybe in some situations that'll be necessary, but if we're not in a super constrained fiscal environment, you may not have to change your scope. It may be that you can get an amendment within some percentage or something like that. But then when you go over that, it may be necessary to come back through a prioritization process. The party that's doing the project may need to decide, well, oh, it's going to take me however many months to get that resolved. I would rather cut the scope back and be done with it. Well, that may be the path that they're taking too. But I just want to suggest that in not every instance will it necessarily be necessary to cut the scope. At least that's what I would hope, if we have the adequate funding. Lots of hands up, so
Tom, go ahead.
Thanks, Lauren. If I could, kind of as a follow-on to what you said, Lauren, I sat on Air Quality Council several years ago and just offer some experience. So we did a similar thing, and Dean, I apologize. We met 4 times a year for 3 days in cost-effective, nice places. But the point of that is, so we had this very structured event too, where projects were prioritized. And our goal as, in this case, a board would review those. They would be presented and they would be ranked. But we had an opportunity to have the project sponsor come in and present. And so that was our final chance to, if you will, kick the tires, do some due diligence, and maybe, you know, if projects are very close, maybe push one in one direction or not the other based on the project team that's presenting. So just to offer that, and then, right, because this is getting very systematic. So what is our purpose? And so one purpose is the co-benefit thing. The other thing is maybe we're the final event before a project is funded. And so looking people in the eye and seeing how the projects are presented might be valuable.
Thanks, Tom. And then my only follow-up here was a comment on the O&M component and whether or not the clean water implementation policy is going to include now a 5th step of maintenance. And if not, does a project include O&M costs in that implementation request for some number of years? And does that then change all of the numbers that are correlated? Because many of these projects do not work without maintenance. And so having funding for them at least one point would be very helpful. And so I don't know if we can build in a 5th step or if we can include that in implementation costs. But that would be my question and concern.
Yeah, if I can just quickly address that. At least in this first year, there will be a separate distribution of funds for O&M. But right now, we don't have projects that are part of this realm to match those O&M funds to. But it's something that the council and the QUISP need to figure out how much and how will they set aside money for the projects that will require O&M over time. So there will be funding. I mean, the promise is made that O&M costs will be funded as part of this system. However, we don't have really good data necessarily on what those costs will be. But the council's, as I'm understanding it right now, the council's job will be to prioritize the projects for the implementation part. I'm not aware of the council's having a role in the awarding of the funds for O&M, that there will be O&M funds that come into the QUISP, and the QUISP will need to match that O&M funding with the projects as they get built. Now, we haven't done any of them, so we're in a fine position. And the initial, I mean, I've seen some things from DEC that suggest that some of the O&M funding initially is going to go towards training, because the O&M system that's been created is a little complex. You have a party that does a project, you've got a landowner. The landowner is a landowner, they're not necessarily the responsible party. So let's say the responsible party is a watershed organization. The QUISP has a role in ensuring that the project is maintained. So there are what are called verifiers and inspectors. So anyway, it's a complicated system that's envisioned, and maybe it will get simpler over time. But some of the initial O&M money is to go towards training parties to be prepared to use that DEC system. But that's just as we get things started. Another thing that I've heard talk about is that some projects that have been done in recent years could be pulled into, so it's an already done project. And one activity that the council could be involved in is to help select projects that were done, let's say in the last 5 years, to decide that's a good project, it's got good phosphorus benefits, it's important that it be maintained the way that it's supposed to be maintained. So we want to direct funding to it. So that could be something that the council does at some point in the fall or the winter, is to choose existing projects, ones already on the ground, and direct O&M funding to. It's just that in order to do that, it may mean that there's some greater formalization of the rights of access, because DEC has developed a form that they want used to ensure that the QUISP, because the QUISP ultimately is legally responsible, they want to make sure that the QUISP would legally have access to that site. Now, these forms exist in some form already, but that's something that may need to be buttoned up. We need a new version of the form to be signed by the property owner in order for it to be pulled into the QUISP WIC system. But that's another way that O&M funds could be used. But going into the future, the QUISP will have to decide, and the WIC will have to decide, how are we going to put money in a pool to be available to pay for O&M. It isn't like it's going to be part, as I understand it, it's not like it's going to be part of the financial request when the project is presented to the WIC for its initial prioritization. Sorry, I'll be quiet now.
Nadine, you have some answers here. That talk as much as you want. Jim, go ahead.
I think Dean's got it right. And there is guidance the state has produced on typical costs and maintenance for various practices. And that would have to be built into your request for funds when that comes about. And like Dean said, you could adopt projects that were previously authorized to some other entity that you think have value, and that cost could be included in your maintenance request. But I wanted to back up and just say on the concern about over costs and contract amendments. Normally in the last few years, there's always been a contingency element to a cost estimate, and that contingency element has been in some cases substantially increased because of COVID. So I just think that if you're measuring, if the council is measuring the cost effectiveness of a project, that they're using the STP calculator to get the cost reduction, they're using the cost estimate from the contractor, and that cost estimate has a contingency built into it. So there should be, enough funds there to cover most unexpected increases. And I know there's a lot of things out there and you don't necessarily know, what material is going to change in price, but so far, we're still authorizing contracts and they're still going, people are working, I think I just looked at Caledonia County had one in Hardwick, and there are some things you have to do to reduce costs, but there's certainly, it seems like the funding has been adequate to date. And therefore you wouldn't need if I understand what you're saying, you wouldn't need a amendment of your grant or your contract with the state. Now you may have to do that with the local builder, but you wouldn't need one from the state.
Thank you, Jim. I think I'll just add on to typically between 100% design to a implementation project, you have at the end of your 100% design, you have an engineer's opinion of probable cost, but you haven't yet requested any bids from actual contractors. And so just noting,
I would agree.
I think even the engineers will own right now that it's none of the numbers that they're coming up with are maybe reliable at this point in time. But I hear your point, Jim. Definitely that there should be enough money for this to all get done. Any other comments on the ranking criteria or funding or all this good stuff? Deep breath. Dean, would you like to discuss the possible funding schedule?
I will just blast through these slides because I think it will get to the more interesting part in just a few minutes. And we are, I love it when conversations happen and they are anticipating things that we've got materials for, and the funding schedule is along those lines. We received an email, I think it was yesterday, from DEC having to do with the draft formula fund contracts. So the QUISs are being asked to look at a template of the contract, and we have until I think the 11th. So I had talked previously about how it seemed like maybe the formula grant agreements could be signed by the middle of August. Well, no, I don't think so. Maybe end of August, but maybe even later. And then, as I had said, there would be a separate grant to cover O&M. But in the future, we've been told that maybe in the future O&M funds will be blended into the formula funds, and then we'll just have to go through some kind of conscious effort to figure out how much of the total pie should be set aside for O&M. I have said this to the Lamoille Council, questions that pop up have to do with how much of the money comes from DEC to the QUISPs in each quarter. And we're sensitive to the fact that certain times of the year may be busier than others. So that's something that's being discussed. And if there's feedback, we want to avoid situations where anybody who's doing a project is delayed. We're, as a QUISP, wanting to make sure that we have the funds so that they can be used to pay the partner and their contractor, rather than having to wait for some additional funds to come down from DEC. So I'm not going to dwell on this, but something other than an equal distribution is being discussed. The schedule overall for prioritization is something that just should be mentioned, and that is, it's going to be helpful to parties to have the money available as early as they can, so that they can go out to bid and get contractors lined up when the contractors are more inclined to pick up their projects. So I've got in this slide some, working back from a February bidding, possibly having the contracting done by January and having the QUISP prioritization in December, although with the Lamoille QUISP, we heard that, that's just kind of a busy time of year. So it's just, I'm showing this slide to illustrate that we're thinking about how these things need to work back from deadlines. And that could mean that the council would be doing its prioritization in, late November, but then it starts to get, we have to deal with the holidays, but then we would have to work back from the prioritization date to the application date, because we need time between receiving the applications and doing the initial prioritization. This is for projects that are going to be in implementation. There could be a different schedule for projects that are not going to construction. They're more of a project identification or project development. My main message is just that it could be a slightly different schedule, and that would mean that the council would be prioritizing, or could be prioritizing these projects at a different time of year. Something that people in the council may want to weigh in on is like, how many times a year should projects come in? I've heard that in one district or QUISP region basin, there may be some kind of ongoing application process. We're not sure in Northwest Vermont if that's how we are seeing things, but I would love to hear comments on that. So how many times a year, when in the year, and so on. We don't want to have partners jammed up with applications for the QUISP process if they're also very busy doing applications for other grant applications. Some questions that I have thrown out have to do with how much of the annual fund should be offered in a cycle. Should we be thinking in terms of a primary award, a major award during the year, and then there's a secondary one? Do people think it would be better to have them even, and so on? How much of the total pie should be reserved for the early stage projects versus the implementation projects? There's been a percentage of a number of 7% used by DEC in some of its calculations. So is 7% for project ID and development the right percentage? Should it be more? And then, as we were talking about earlier, what about O&M funds, and how will those be set aside? I'm not expecting answers now, trying to stir the pot, get people to think about these things, and they can be discussed more in future meetings. And I will stop there and let people speak.
Kim, is your hand still up? Okay, great. Just want to make sure. Dean, my only thoughts on scheduling that I'll share right now. Lake Champlain Basin Program grant usually opens early October. And so in some way, it would be great to have an answer on like the quiz money or LCVP money before you know if you need to go submit it to the others group. At least for like big implementation projects, you know, project development is not something that LCVP really funds. But just thinking about the two pots of money there. And I'll say I would love an open application for project development. I think that that is how projects come to me, and that would make sense as a potential applicant. Other thoughts from folks? Yes, Beth.
Do we have a handle on how many projects will be coming in and the amount of time, that the intricacy of the projects that we may be reviewing? I like Lauren's idea of accepting them as they come in, you know, in relation to just from a timely perspective.
I don't have an answer to that question, although I will say that I had started to work on a survey, and I ended up getting discouraged about using a survey to try to get that information. I would be interested in what people think, but I feel it's important to get some idea of how many applications do you, as you know, dear organization, dear partner, how many applications of what type and for how much money do you think you might apply for? I didn't do that survey. I've got something ready, but it's doing a survey, or it's calling everybody up and doing it over the phone, or getting a meeting together where everybody shares that information. I have not done that, but it is something that I would like to do if it's possible, so that we have some idea. The closer we get, you know, we may run out of time, I guess, if people feel like the money becomes available, people may want to just open the process, and then we'll know based on applications. But I would love to know in advance how many project applications we might actually get. I just can't answer that question.
It's also my understanding that DEC has a list of potential projects. And I'm wondering if we have a handle on that list.
Well, we have a lot of, well, there is the project data. Yeah, there's the project database that has a lot of projects in it. There are many different project lists. There are the list of projects in the tactical basin plan. There's no one fully synthesized list. So I'm not sure if you were talking about something other than the project database.
Well, I guess I'm wondering if, I mean, do we have anybody knocking on our door right now? I know that in the Memphremagog Basin, the discussion is we're going to have to go out and find projects, and you know, see where we can get the projects from. And the DEC list was one of the places that they were going to start.
Yeah, I think that we will need to promote the availability of the funds amongst municipalities. The organizations know about the usual organizations that do these types of projects are aware of the funding, but I think we will need to promote the availability of the funds in order to get more project ideas. But there's this tension because the organizations need the capacity to put together the materials. But yeah, long story short, the QUISPs will probably, in the Missisquoi at least, will probably be promoting project input, whatever you want to call it, to build up the list of projects, because we will have more funds than projects, at least initially. Not that we want to use the funding indiscriminately, and we can save the funds. We don't have to spend the funds, but the targets would suggest, we're going to do, maybe 20 significant projects, and I don't know that we'll have 20 significant projects as part of our first funding round.
And I also, from a municipal perspective, the catchphrase of non-regulatory can be confusing. I'm wondering if we can get a list of example projects that we could present if we're going to have to kind of beat the bushes, and advertise. I think a list of example projects would be really helpful, particularly if we're approaching municipalities for projects.
Yeah,
And like what's regulated, what's not, and what falls into this pot of funding.
Yeah, and I think you might have mentioned that idea before, and I spent a couple of hours in Richford yesterday, and essentially that's what I was doing. It can be pretty time consuming, but it will be necessary to help educate local officials about what this money can be used for. Example projects are helpful, but it's going to take some time for people to understand, what do you mean when you're talking about a project that could be eligible for QUISP funding, and it may be, related to the road system, but it's not one that's part of the general roads permit. So yeah, a list of projects is something that someone, if not you, had mentioned before, and it just isn't something that I can hand out at this moment.
Right, it could be very confusing. That's why I am bringing it up, because it would be better to be clear about things.
I think DEC is planning on hosting a training to go over what kind of projects are what. I don't have a date or any information on that, but Stacy mentioned it. I do want to, before I get to you, Sarah, there is a question in the chat, Dean. Is funding available to support agricultural projects that are not required by the RAPs? And I know I still get a little confused because the answer is like, yes, but also.
Yeah, so yes is the short answer, but there is, again, this is very process oriented. So we have to fill out paperwork that gets reviewed by the Agency of Ag folks to determine that it would be something that is a QUISP project rather than an Agency of Ag project. So yes, QUISP funds can be used for the non-regulated farms. So a conservation project on a farm that is governed by the RAPs could be done using QUISP funds, and a project on a very, very small farm, a homestead type farm, could be funded. It's just that Agency of Ag has this ability to monitor and be sure that we're not trying to use QUISP project funding for something that they have jurisdiction over. And I can share an example of that with you, Vicki, if you want to see what the form the Agency of Ag has developed looks like.
I would be curious to see that form as well, Dean. Sarah, go ahead.
I wanted to respond to Beth when she was talking about trying to beat the bushes to get projects, and hearing Dean talking about Richford. I think that, and we're new, that I think we need to go, as you said, with a revolving application process, because I think it's going to be an evolving landscape. And if we have set deadlines, I'm concerned we are not going to have projects cleaning up the lake as fast as we'd like to see. And so I think it's real important, particularly at the outset, to have a revolving door to get the applications in.
Thank you, Sarah. Tom.
Dean, just maybe a question. Are you in a position to present a draft RFP to the council, which would kind of define what kind of projects we're looking for and so on and so forth? Not to go public yet, but at least for us to review.
So you use it. We will announce the availability of funding. So maybe you're calling something an RFP, and I'm just using different terminology, but we will be doing an announcement of the availability of project funds. No, I don't have a draft of that. We have drafts of what are called requests for qualifications that are intended to help speed up the process for partners. I mean, this is, yes, I don't know how much background you have on the pre-qualification elements of the rule, but there are some advantages to pre-qualifying partners. So we have a draft of the request for qualifications document for partners, and we also have a draft of the request for qualifications for the actual contractor types. So that's one of the next things that is going to happen now that the Regional Planning Commission has adopted certain policies that it needed to have in place. The call for projects, though, and maybe that's what you mean, and I'll stop and just ask, that's what you mean. You're talking about something that says to the world, this funding is available, you can submit applications.
Yeah, I think so. Like you go to Lake Champlain Basin program, and then they have categories of requests for proposals. Like, hey, we want a application on this topic, and this topic, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And it lays out the structure of what they're looking for, what the qualification criteria and everything is.
Yeah. So we're going to do something simpler than a request for proposals, because the request for proposals suggests an amount of information that I don't think is going to be necessary. As long as something is an eligible project type and it has the information that we need to prioritize, that's all that we really want people to provide. We don't want to ask them to do some kind of full-blown justification of the project to do a simple application. So that's, maybe we're just looking at RFPs a little bit differently, but we don't have a draft yet. And that's why I said, I've said previously, the application process will be driven by the information that we know is needed to prioritize it. So, and we want to keep that information needed to prioritize it as minimal as possible. So if it ends up being 3 points of information, it's name, contact information, those 3 points of information about the project, and then we get it into the prioritization process and bring it to the council for prioritization. But organizations will need to know it's available. And like I was saying earlier, the partner organizations, many of them are aware of this, municipalities less so. So as Beth was saying, there's going to be the need to educate municipalities about this, I think, more than the watershed organizations and the conservation districts of the world. And whether or not there are any other entities out there that might also apply, we will need to try to find education opportunities for them as well. Maybe we're talking about two different, it's the same thing, but from two different angles. I just don't have that application. I mean, the thing that I was going to talk about in terms of the application process is, you know, we want it to be digital to reduce the paperwork. We want it to be possible to automate as many things as possible. We want to collect the required data that is needed to prioritize, but not go further. And we want to be sure that when something is going to require a landowner or property owner commitment, we have that. But it's going to be pretty basic. It's educating people that this funding is available. Maybe what people are getting at is they need to understand the eligible project types. And Karen was kind enough to provide the link to the document that is the Bible, so to speak, or the authority, better phrase, on what these funds can be used for. So if you look at that document and you have a project idea that fits within those, then it would be eligible for this type of funding. Maybe what I'm hearing is, could at the next meeting there be a presentation, or well, what will that look like? What is the hard schedule for the release of that announcement? And that's something I can do better than trying to keep babbling on about right now.
Yeah, I guess I'll say, I know like Chittenden, the CCRPC released their RFQ for project implementers or project for conservation districts and other folks on BWICS to fill out.
And that's, sorry, but that's different from the project piece. That is simply to get you so that they can sole source the project that you submit to you and guarantee that a project sponsor is the one that gets to do the work.
Right. Yes, so many fun things. I do just want to briefly make sure we're up to date on the chat because I hadn't been saying it out loud. And so we do have some feedback on how often folks would like to meet, including quarterly, hybrid, once a year, quarterly, somewhere we can all meet in the middle or on the sides with virtual abilities. We should at least have one in-person meeting. Karen Bates did share the CWIP funding policy. We can also include that in the follow-up email. And then Kent also mentioned that he wanted the VAFM form. So maybe that form can also just be included in the wrap-up email, Dean. That would be great. And looking at the agenda. I guess we're at the project discussion now. Dean, is that correct? So we did kind of funding schedule and application process and schedule in the same kind of chunk. Okay. So Jim Peace, if you would like to take us away. You are muted if you are talking to us. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Maybe, well, let me start, but Dean, we should probably go to the handout for the Giddings Brook project. And I'm going to rely on Dean to fill in some of the gaps here. But the DEC lab is declared Giddings Brook as impaired for sediment, and Giddings Brook is, if you don't know, it is in the just to the west of Enosburg Falls, and there's a combination of lack of buffer in the upper stream, which is predominantly golf course and cornfields or farm fields, and then there's this stormwater discharges in the lower watershed, and the sampling site is right at the rail trail crossing. Yeah, right there, I believe. So we had thought several months ago, if not years ago, that some type of improvement to trap the sediment and phosphorus going into the Missisquoi from the village would make sense. And these are the drainages. There's number 9, number 16. There's another one to the south there, number 10. There's actually another one on Orchard Street, is number 30. They all sort of discharge in relatively close proximity to each other on the east side of the brook, just north of the rail trail on, is it Kendrick's? What is their, the property? So, well, anyway, so there's room possibly to do something at the, in terms of a gravel wetland near the outfall. However, there is quite a bit of state wetlands, class 2 wetlands, adjacent to the brook. I think, no, I guess it's not on, oh yeah, is that wetlands? No, I guess, so that area there where the purple highlighted pond is, there's room potentially to do something on that property. And I think Dean has spoken with the landowner. The landowner is willing to consider doing something. I can't remember their name. But so there is a willing landowner. The biggest issue is that there's quite a bit of wetlands in adjacent to the stream and out. They're class 2 wetlands. The class 2 wetlands have a 50-foot buffer on them. So we're somewhat restricted as to what could be done in that area. And in the wetland staff's position, and Dean, jump in any point, there's a wetland delineation has been done. And I haven't seen it. And I don't know if we have a copy of it or not, but we would have to stay out of the wetlands and the 50-foot buffer. And just a rough guesstimate, we would need, if we built a system that could hold maybe 3 to 4 feet of water in it, so basically a pond, gravel wetland, constructed wetland, something like that. And there's some images or examples of them from the state stormwater manual in that report. If they were 4 feet deep, we would need a quarter to a half an acre of land that was outside of the buffer. Outside, there's also a sewer line, municipal sewer lines through that area to make a dent in the phosphorus reduction in the stream and in Missisquoi, and improve the water quality of the brook. And again, and maybe Karen will speak to this, but there's also another project further upstream working on the buffers. I think you've talked about that, to improve the vegetated buffers along the golf course and other parts of the stream. So that's a project that's sort of been out there. That's potentially feasible if we can get a permit or an approval from the DEC Wetlands Division.
Yeah, Jim, I'm happy to just chime in a bit. The property owner is Kirkpatrick. Her maiden name is Bonk. Val Bonk is someone who I believe created the mobile home park that is just to the west. Longtime Enosburg business person. And yes, we have a willing landowner, knock on wood, and we have done a wetlands delineation. The reason I haven't shared it on screen is just because the version that I have from the consultant, she had indicated was still draft. She needed to make some changes based on the comments from the state wetland ecologist who visited. And the situation that we are in is one that I was alluding to earlier when Lauren said, is there a deadline for some of these personnel to provide comments on things? I believe the site visit was on the week of July 4th. And some verbal comments were made that were somewhat concerning, that would lead us to believe that maybe there was no chance at all of doing a project because so much of the property is wetland. Since then, it seems a little bit more promising. So the permitting world is not much friendlier for environmental projects than it is for other types of projects, although in theory, at least, a project that is to create or to resolve or help solve an existing problem does have a slightly easier path than, say, a project that's related to some new development. We're waiting for the written version of the comments so that we can decide how to go forward. But if we're lucky, there will be enough room outside of wetlands to develop a design for a project in that area, which, as Jim said, would help a water course that has been identified on the 303D list. I'll just stop there. Jim, do you want to go on to Sutton?
Yeah, because I have to leave at 1. And a second project, which probably has a little more viability right now, is looking at the illicit discharges that are coming into Missisquoi Bay from Quebec. I've talked to a few towns. I'm hoping Ken can talk to a few others. The town of Sutton has indicated a willingness to cooperate and participate in a, basically, this would be the first step in a illicit discharge survey, which would be to build a drainage map of the area. And luckily Sutton has some of their area mapped. I don't know if you're familiar with that area, but there is a ski area to the east. The idea would be to map as much of the drainage as we could. Apparently they do have CSOs of a certain type. It has something to do with vegetable washing into the stream. We would be looking just at the stormwater system. When I say we, I would just be advising as a citizen. The Lake Champlain Basin Program is supposed to have an RFP out in this month, I believe. They said early August. And they will entertain a number of grant options. And this one, obviously, since it's in Quebec, would involve the Great Lakes fishery money that the Basin Program manages. The Watershed Consulting Associates would be willing to apply for the grant for Sutton to basically just develop a map. And I mean, we haven't drafted it. They wanted to see the RFP before they drafted up a proposal, but the proposal would either do just the mapping of the infrastructure so that we could then do a separate grant to test it, or possibly, since we originally hoped to do more of the Missisquoi Bay drainage, but we haven't really been able to get a go-ahead from any of the towns. Possibly we could do both the drainage mapping in one phase, and then the second phase of the same grant, we would do the outfall testing. And the head of public works there would seem very enthusiastic and willing to participate. So it does seem like a doable project, but we've got to get some of the basic work done. We do find illicit discharges all around the state. We found about 300 in Vermont, And now we expanded into New York and Quebec for the Lake Champlain drainage. We're finding a number in New York as well. So I don't know, we won't know, but that's the idea, would be to submit a grant proposal. And again, the Watershed Consulting Associates would be willing to do it if once we get the RFP.
Thanks, Jim.
That's all.
No. Dean, do you have something to add? I saw you came off mute.
No, I wanted to thank Jim for suggesting that we take a look at some projects as part of a meeting. And I was familiar with the Giddings project. I did not know really anything about the illicit discharge work that's going on. I'm kind of puzzling through what kinds of projects might ultimately, if any, come through the council for its prioritization, but I think it's good to have an idea of the kinds of work that's going on just in general. So I didn't have anything else to add.
Dean, I have to go, but is there anything on the buffers on Giddings Brook? Any?
So my attention has been focused on the gravel wetland type project. There has been some talk. It's been a few months now about doing some kind of buffer project, but that hasn't been the focus of my work. Sarah's got her hand up because she's on the Conservation Commission, and they have been looking at buffers. So I'm going to turn things over to Sarah.
We are hitting stumbling blocks of getting access to people's land. And so we are spinning our wheels, and because we don't know what we're doing, that obviously has exacerbated the problem, because we wanted to get on the land to, and Karen was helpful with us on, being able to look at and talk about the maps, but we feel like unless we can get onto people's property, we can't go we can't move forward. The first property we wanted to tackle is owned by a relative of where Dean is talking about, and he has some disabilities and doesn't like people on his land. So that has just been my first obstacle. And then we're trying to work past that and see where we can go. So we haven't made much progress, but we've been trying. So I'm apologize for that, but I'm sure other people have found obstacles as they've been trying to work on projects as well.
Karen, go ahead.
Hi, Sarah, it's Karen. And I'm sorry about the obstacles. I definitely have seen that happen before. And so one question, are you working with Lindsay, Missisquoi River Basin Association?
No, we hadn't gotten there because we wanted to get on the land, look at it, because we talked, and heard presentations. We thought we needed to inventory before we could make suggestions to Lindsay. Should we have done it the other way around?
Well, Lindsay, and I'm sure she's on the call, could add to this, but I know that the watershed groups they're very savvy as to understanding how to approach landowners. I also think if you found, through using aerial photography that we have with the ARC or the ANR environmental atlas, you might be able to find some areas that obviously look like they need buffers, and being able to start the conversation with the landowner of not just inventory, but we could provide this service for you. We could provide trees for you if you'd want to talk about it. But anyway, Lindsay may know how to approach a landowner based on previous experience. So
Okay.
it might be a good idea, the next step, to invite her to a meeting just to talk about how you get people to say yes.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. I'll be in touch with Lindsay.
Yeah, I just want to say everything Karen said. Yeah, give me a shout. Sarah. We'd be happy to work with you guys.
I just dropped this in the chat, but the Conservation Commission has been working with Stacy. I don't know what the last contact with Stacy was, but I believe she did a kind of desktop assessment using aerial photographs, LiDAR, and what have you to make some recommendations or at least provide some input.
I'll add to the district got funded to host a bioengineering workshop, and one of the ideas was to host it at a golf course, and maybe this would be a good collaborative project that many of us could work on together. So feel free to keep me in the loop too, Lindsay and Sarah. Beth, go ahead.
Hi, I just wanted to let you know I need to leave right at 1. And is there anything that we'll need to vote on maybe? I don't want to leave and not leave you a quorum.
I think we're done voting for the day.
All
Yes,
right.
okay.
Sorry, everybody have a wonderful week.
Thanks, Beth.
Bye-bye.
Actually, on that note, unless there's further comment on the projects that Jim presented or some of the comments that Karen and others have made, Dean, is it time to wrap up?
Yes, I would say it is time to wrap up, and I was just trying to refresh my memory about the next meeting date, which is going to be on September 7th, I
7th.
believe. Yes. And among the things that may appear on the agenda would be some version of the prioritization system with real project information in it, and other items inspired by comments people have made today.
Sorry, Dean, you might have just said this. Do you need a project spotlight for September?
If someone would like to suggest one, that would be great.
If anyone would like to present a fun project, let Dean know. And if Dean, if you get desperate, let me know. Wonderful. I think we can move to adjourn. Would anyone like to make a motion as such?
I move that we adjourn.
Thank you, Dan Seeley. Lindsay, I see you also came off mute.
I'll second it.
Wonderful. All in favor, please thumbs up or wiggle. All opposed? None. All right. So everyone who is still here voted in favor. We will adjourn this meeting and see everyone in a month. I know Dean has many resources to share in that follow-up email, so please do look at it. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good one.